Who was Solon? What things did he accomplish during his lifetime, and why should we remember him? Born in Athens, Greece in the year 640 BCE, Solon, plain and simple, was one of the most influential men in history. He was a merchant, a philosopher, a poet, and a legislator. He is also considered one of the 7 wise men of ancient Greece, and is one of the few people in antiquity to have actually deserved his own biography. As a matter of fact, most of what we know about his life is because it was written down by the great historian Plato in his master work, The Life of
We should recall at the very beginning that, in very rough terms, it was some 9,000 years since the time when a war is recorded as having broken out between the peoples dwelling outside the pillars of Heracles and all those dwelling within. This war I must now describe. Now, they said that this city of Athens was the ruler of the Mediterranean peoples and fought for the duration of the entire war. They said too that the kings of the island of Atlantis were the rulers of the other peoples. This island, as we were saying, was at one time greater than both Libya and Asia combined, but now because of earthquakes it has subsided into the great ocean and has produced a vast sea of mud that blocks the passage of mariners who would sail into the great ocean from Greek waters, and for this reason it is no longer navigable. In its progress, our tale will describe, as if it were unrolled, the many barbarian nations and all the different Greek peoples of that time, encountering them as they emerge from place to place. It is first necessary at the beginning of this tale to describe the condition of the Athenians of that age, and the adversaries with whom they waged war, their respective power and their respective constitutions. But of these themes, pride and place must go to the condition of Athens before this war. The names of these first inhabitants have been preserved, but their deeds have perished on account of the catastrophes that befell those who succeeded them, and the long passage of time intervening. Those of their race who survived these successive destructions were, as I said before, left as an illiterate mountain people who had only heard the tradition of the names of the rulers of their country, and beyond these only a little of their deeds. Now they were pleased to give their descendants the names of these rulers, even though they were unaware of their ancestors' virtues and institutions, except for some dim legends concerning each of them. Then, for many generations, these survivors and their children lived in distress for their survival, and gave thought to their needs. They spoke only of supplying these needs, and had no interest in the events of the distant past, for it is in the train of leisure that mythology and inquiry into the past arrive in cities, once they have observed that in the case of some peoples the necessities of life have been secured, but not before. This is why the names of the ancients have been preserved, but not their deeds. I make this claim and cite as my evidence the statement of Solon, who said that, in their account of the war of that time, the Egyptian priests gave for the most part names such as Cecrops, and Erechtheus, and Erichthonius, and Aristoton, and the names of the most of the others, which have come down in tradition before the generation of Theseus. And the same is true of the names of the women. Consider too the attributes of the goddess Athena and her statue. At that time the military training of women and men was common. For this reason the people of that time fashioned the statue of the goddess as armed to reflect that ancient custom, an indication that all the female and male creatures that live together in a flock can very well pursue in common, as much as is possible, the special talents that are suited to each species. The report of the Egyptian priests concerning our territory was plausible and true. First of all, at that time its boundaries extended to the Isthmus of Corinth, and on the mainland to the north they extended to the summits of the Cytherian and Parnes, and descending to the east, the boundaries extended down to the region of Oropus to the north, and they were defined by the Asopus River down to the sea. In its great fertility our land far surpassed every other, for it was then capable of supporting a great army of men who did not work the land. This is impressive evidence for excellence. What has now survived of this land can rival any other land in the variety and quality of its crops, and the pastures it offers all species of animals. But at that time our land produced all this not only of high quality, but in great abundance. You might ask how this is credible, and how our present land could possibly be called a vestige of our earlier land. From the interior, the entire land extends a great distance into the sea, as if it jutted out as a promontory. It so happens that the entire basin of the sea that surrounds falls off precipitously. Many and great were the floods that occurred in the space of 9,000 years, for this is the number of years between that time and the present, and during this succession of natural disasters the soil was washed down from the high places. It did not form any considerable alluvial deposits as in other regions, but it disappeared into the deep, as in flood after flood it was continuously washed into the sea from all sides. What actually remains is like our small and barren islands, and, compared to the land it once was, Attica of today is like the skeleton revealed by a wasting disease once all the rich topsoil has been eroded and only the thin body of the land remains. But in that age our land was undiminished and had high hills with soil upon them. What we now call the rocky barrens were covered with deep rich soil, and in the mountains there were dense forests of which there still survives clear evidence. Some of our mountains can now grow just barely enough for the bees, but it was not so long ago that lofty trees grew there. There can still be found intact rafters cut from trees that were felled and brought down to be used for the greatest building projects, and there were many trees that were cultivated for their fruit, and they provided limitless fodder for flocks of sheep and goats. Every year there was a harvest of Zeus-sent rain. It was not lost as it is now, as it flows off the hard surface of the ground into the sea, but the deep soil absorbed the rain, and it stored it away, as it created a reservoir with a covering of clay soil above it, and as it distributed the water it had absorbed from the high places into its hollows, it produced an abundant flow of water to feed springs and rivers throughout every region of the country. There are even today some sacred monuments at these ancient springs that are evidence of the truth of what we are now saying about our country. As for the city itself, it was laid out at that time in a plan that I will now describe. First of all, the Acropolis was very different then than it is now. A single night of torrential rain stripped the Acropolis of its soil and reduced it to bare limestone in a storm that was accompanied by earthquakes. Before the destructive flood of Deucalion, this was the third such cataclysmic storm. In the past, the Acropolis extended to the Eridanus and Ilissus, and held within its circuits the Pnyx and Mount Lycabettus that faces the Pnyx. It was entirely covered by soil and, except for some small outcroppings, level on top. There was a single spring in the location of the present Acropolis, but it had been choked by the debris of the earthquakes of that night, and its waters now flow only in a trickle about the circuit wall. But it provided the men of that age with an abundant supply of water, since it was situated in a location that made it neither too cold in the winter nor too hot in the summer. This was the manner of their life. They were the guardians of their own citizens and the leaders of the rest of the Greek world, which followed them willingly. As for the state of those who went to war against them, and the origins of that state, we will now openly reveal its history to you, our friends, as the common property of friends, if we have not lost the memory of what we heard when we were still boys. I must explain one small point before I enter into my history, so that you will not be astonished as you hear Greek names frequently used for people who are not Greek. You will now learn the origins of these names. Solon when he was contemplating his own poetic version of this legend and was inquiring into the meaning of these names, discovered that his Egyptian sources had been the first to record them, once they had translated their meaning into their own language. He, in his turn, recovered the meaning of each of these names and recorded it as he translated them into Greek. These very manuscripts were in the possession of my grandfather, and they now remain in my possession. When I was a boy, I studied them carefully. Consequently, do not be astonished if you hear names that sound like Greek names. You now know their explanation. What follows approximately was the introduction to the long account I heard then. As I said before concerning the distribution of lands among the gods, in some regions they divided the entire earth into greater apportionments, and in others into lesser apportionments, as they established sanctuaries and sacrifices for themselves. So it was that Poseidon received as one of his domains the island of Atlantis, and he established dwelling places for the children he had fathered of a mortal woman in a certain place on the island that I shall describe. Now, seaward, but running along the middle of the entire island, was a plain which is said to have been the loveliest of all plains and quite fertile. Near this plain in the middle of the island, and at about 50 stades distance, was a uniformly low and flat hill. Now there lived on this hill one of the people of this island who had originally sprung up from the earth. His name was Evenor, and he dwelt there with his wife, Leucippe. They had an only child, a daughter, by the name of Cleito. When this girl grew to marriageable age, both her mother and father died. It was then that Poseidon conceived the desire for her, and slept with her. He sired 5 pairs of twin sons, and he raised them to manhood. He divided the entire island of Atlantis into 10 districts. To the first-born of the first set of twins he gave as his portion the dwelling of his mother and the circular island, since it was the largest and the best. And he made him king over the others. The other sons he made governors, and to each of these he gave the rule over many men and a great extent of land. And he gave each of his sons names. To the son who was oldest and king he gave the name from which the entire island and its surrounding sea derived their names, because he was the first of the kings of that time. His name was Atlas. The island is called Atlantis, and the sea Atlantic after him. To the twin born after him, who had received as his portion the cape of the island facing the pillars of Heracles, opposite what is now called the territory of Gadara, after this region, he gave the name that translate into Greek as Eumelos, but in the language of Atlantis it is Gadarus. It would seem that he gave his name to the region of Cadiz. The 2 brothers of the second set of twins he called Ampheres and the Euaemon. To the third set he gave the name Nasius to the firstborn, and Autocton to the secondborn. Of the fourth set, Elasippus was the firstborn, Mestor the second. For the fifth set he gave the name Azaz to the firstborn, and the name Diaprepes to the second. Now all of these sons inhabited the island, as did their sons and descendants over many generations. They were the rulers of many other islands in the Atlantic, and, as I have said, they even extended their rule into the Mediterranean as near to us as Etruria and Egypt.